I'm Ling, and today I'm super excited to show you this handbag that I just finished making. It's the Balenciaga Hourglass handbag in the size medium, which usually retails for $21.50. There's no way in hell that I was going to pay that much for a handbag, so instead I recreated it myself out of some leather that I found on an abandoned couch. This is some of the leather that came from the couch. You can see it's not perfect. It does have some imperfections and damage, so I had to be pretty strategic about where I cut the panels from. But it did end up working out because there was quite a bit of this leather. Let me explain a little bit more about the cost that went into this bag. Like I said, the leather was free, but the total cost was $6, and that comes from the hardware, which I got from Amazon. These D-rings were 10 cents each. And then on the strap side, I have these lobster claws. These were 80 cents each, and I have 2 of those. The biggest cost was actually the double-sided tape that I used. I went through 3 cartridges of it, and each cartridge is $1, so that's $3 there. And then the last thing that is holding everything together is the thread, which I also got on Amazon. And I got the entire roll of thread for $10, and I barely touched it, so I'm gonna estimate that cost for the thread on this bag to be $1. I really like this bag because of the symmetry. I love this curve that it has. I think that's what is the most eye-catching feature of the bag, and it also enables the bag to stand up like this in a pretty stable way. The other thing that I'm pretty proud of is that the inside of the bag is fully lined. It's my first time making a bag that is fully lined with leather. I've been avoiding it because I thought that it was a lot more work, and usually I finish a bag and I'm like, okay, I'm done. I don't really care what the inside looks like. But it does make a huge difference. It makes it look like an actual finished bag that someone would buy. The other thing that I added on here is this golden ring. I actually tore this off of a really bad fake LV bag that I found in a dumpster when I was like 12 years old. It was actually one of the D rings on the bag, but because it is so big, it actually works on this bag pretty well. On the Balenciaga bag, it's a B, which I think is the logo, but I didn't really feel like trying to track that down, and I actually like the more simple look of this ring. And then the last feature that I really like is this huge pocket in the back. I think it's going to be really handy for storing anything that I need quick access to, like a mask or my phone, so I can just stuff it in here and grab it really quickly without having to open up this main flap. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of how this bag came together, I want to just give you a really quick overview of my design approach and process for recreating this bag. The first thing I did was look on the internet to find some nice designer handbag styles that I wanted to recreate. Once I settled on this one, I just pulled up some pictures. I actually did consider ordering one and using that as a reference on hand that I could check against, but it is $2,000. I didn't really want to risk having to ship that back and getting it lost in the mail, because that has happened to me before with a really large order that I had to spend like 6 months chasing my money down for, so I'm kind of traumatized. And the pictures on the website worked fine. I just used those pictures, and I took this really large piece of paper. I think it's packing paper. I'm not really sure what it's called, but I just used that paper to draw out the patterns that I think comprise the panels of this bag. And once I had those drawn out, I cut them out, stuck them together, loosely recreated this bag just to make sure that the size and the fit made sense. And then once I had those panels, I slapped them onto some of the actual leather and I started cutting. Once I start cutting, I pretty much enter this blur and haze of just trying to get the bag done as soon as possible. I actually just moved into a new apartment and I barely started unpacking. I was so consumed with trying to finish this bag, and I was able to get it done in 4 days, which I think is pretty quick. But back to the design process, once I have the leather cut out, because I have done a few of these bags, I have a good idea of how these things come together, or at least I have a good idea of what I need to do 2 or 3 steps ahead. So I just keep chasing that down. I pretty much just wing the whole thing, which has caused me a little bit of issues, but I think in general it does work out pretty well, and it does enable me to work super fast. But yeah, that's the general overview and approach. Now we'll get into the actual footage and I'll explain exactly how this bag came together. Alright, here I'm pretty much done cutting, but what I like to do is cut and assemble at the same time and use some of the first pieces as reference, and it's also a good way to make sure that everything's going to make sense. Here I'm applying Tokonol onto the edges of the flaps that are going to make up the front panel. This is just going to make sure those edges are nice and shiny before stitching. Now I'm pricking out those stitching holes. It's a pretty aggressive and loud process, but I actually really enjoy the process of punching holes into leather. I find it to be a good way to channel my aggression. Now I'm doing my first fit check. I like to do this periodically throughout the process to make sure that everything looks good. It's being held together mostly with double-sided tape, but I also like to reinforce it with binder clips just to make sure that none of the pieces move around. And here's the result of the first fit check. It was good enough for me to feel confident to continue going. Now I'm just measuring out the length of thread that I need to stitch up this panel. The general rule that I use is 4 times the length of what you're going to be stitching. Alright, here I'm stitching, which is a pretty long manual process, but I do find it to be pretty therapeutic. Lately I've been listening to the news or podcasts, mostly because when I went home about a year ago, my brother and my parents were having a conversation about current events, and I just sat there like an ignorant dummy, not knowing what was going on, and my brother said, "Ling, you know, maybe you should keep up with current events so that you can have intelligent conversations with people." And I was like, ooh, damn Ping, I think you have a point. Now that the stitching is done, I'm just melting it to make sure that it doesn't unravel and go anywhere. Here I'm applying Tokonole again to the other 3 panel flap. I actually forgot to do it before I stitched, which isn't ideal, but I ended up still being able to make it work. Here I'm just running my wood slicker back and forth on the edge to make sure that it's polished and as shiny as possible. Now I'm working on the bottom of the bag. I wanted it to be a little bit stiffer, so I repurposed cardboard from a cereal box, cut out 2 long rectangles, and stuck them together with a ton of double-sided tape. Now that my bottom stiffener is ready to go, I'm just attaching it onto the leather bottom panel. Here I have my handy dandy roll of duct tape to make sure that the adhesive is fully activated. Now I'm just using my awl to mark out the diagonal stitching lines that I'm going to be putting in. Now I'm pricking out the stitching holes for the bottom panel. It took a few hits because I was hammering through 2 layers of leather and 2 layers of cardboard. And now we're back to stitching again. You can see it's a pretty repetitive and iterative process of cutting, sticking, pricking, and stitching. Here's how the stitching turned out. It's important to have the stitching in addition to the double-sided tape to make sure that that stack up of materials is not going to budge. Now I'm working on the front flap. I'm using my wing divider to mark out the line that I'm going to be pricking into. Now I've moved on to the ring attachment. Here I'm cutting out the strip of leather that is going to go around the ring, and then I'm attaching it onto some thinner black leather just because I didn't want the raw suede side to be interfacing with the metal ring. Even with that thinner black leather, the stack up ended up being a little bit too thick, so I'm just using my skiving knife to thin it back down. After stitching the 2 pieces together, I was pretty happy with how it turned out. Alright, now it's time to work on the handle. For handles, it's pretty common to use this cord piping to fill out the handle and give it that structure, but I didn't have any and I didn't really feel like spending money on any, so instead I just took this brown leather that one of my coworkers gave to me from his old couch, and I've rolled it up into my version of cord piping. Now I'm taking my piping and I'm wrapping the red leather around it. This part was a little bit tricky because I wanted to avoid the bottom part of the curved handle from having excess bunched leather, so I took my knee and I used it to pin down and stretch the leather while I carefully wrapped the red leather around my piping. Next, I'm finishing off the ends of the handles. Honestly, I didn't really know what I was doing here. I probably should have watched a tutorial, but I ended up just sort of sticking and repasting and cutting. It was kind of like sculpting leather. But I think overall it turned out pretty well. If you look too closely, it definitely looks like a bit of a mangled mess, but it's alright. Here I'm pricking out the stitching holes along the entire length of the handle, and now I am stitching it all together. Now I'm using Tokonole to polish up the raw edges after stitching. This is probably one of my favorite things to do. Check out how shiny that raw edge is now. I left this binder clip in overnight to try to train that curve into the leather handle. Now I'm cutting the liner leather for the bag. I'm skiving down 3 of the 4 edges where 4 pieces of leather are going to eventually end up meeting. Here I'm installing the magnet, which is actually pretty straightforward to do. You just have to cut 2 slits that these metal prongs get fed through, and then they get bent over the metal backing on the other side. The most important thing is just making sure that your magnet is in the right place. Now that I have my liner and my magnet installed, that buckle that I worked on earlier is ready to be shoved between the liner and the main flap. This is my second fit check, again just making sure everything looks okay. Here I'm installing the D-rings for the strap attachment. What I did was I took a strip of leather, cut a slip into the handle, and fed that strip in. Then I pricked some holes and I stitched it all together. Here I'm stitching up the front piece. Even though I do like stitching, I actually just bought a sewing machine because I'm hoping that it'll help speed along some of the stitching process. Moving on to the pocket, what I did was I stitched the front flap to the liner, and then I stitched the back flap individually with the exception of these 2 ends, which I then stitched all together, and that's what ended up creating the pocket. Now I'm attaching the handle onto the body of the bag. I used tape to position it into place, and then I'm pricking it onto just the top flap, not the liner as well, because I don't want the stitches to be visible from the underside where the liner is. Now that the handle is installed, I'm ready to close it up and stitch the liner to the front flap. This is the part where things start getting super exciting for me. I'm getting ready to stitch the bottom panel to the front panel and using double-sided tape and binder clips to hold it together. Now I'm stitching it together in supersonic speed, and check it out! It is starting to look like a bag. This is the underside where the stitch is going to be hidden. After stitching the back panel onto the bottom, this is what it looks like without the side panels. It kind of just looks like a long roll. Now I'm getting the side panels ready with tape and binder clips once again. Lots of binder clips just to make sure that nothing is moving. And this is my third and final fit check. At this point there was really no turning back, but it looked pretty good. I'm stitching the side panels onto the front, the bottom, and the back, and then melting it in place to make sure that it's not going to unravel. This is what it looks like after I'm done stitching. You can see the edges still look pretty raw and unfinished, but that's where Tolkien comes in to save the day. I ended up just doing this for like 3 hours until all of the edges looked really shiny, and then I was done. Alright, that's it for the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you guys have any recommendations for anything else you think I should make, or any other designer handbags that you think look good, let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear what you guys think. This morning I actually bought some more leather from someone on Craigslist who was selling leather for super cheap. So I have a ton more colors and just a lot more variety to play with, so I'm really excited to make some more things.